Hello and welcome to this Monday Mercy video from Jubilee Plus. Great to see you today, and I'm going to talk this morning about a text that really helped us in Jubilee Plus as we've developed our work over many years, and it comes from Paul's letter to Galatians chapter 2 and verse 10, where famously Peter the apostle is quoted as saying that he encouraged Paul and his colleagues to always remember the poor. That key expression, remember the poor. But this statement doesn't make a lot of sense until we look at the context. And the context is that Peter and many of the other apostles were based in Jerusalem and in Jewish areas in Israel. And they were planting churches there amongst Jewish communities. And in those churches, obviously, they had made it a priority that those church communities should reach out to the vulnerable and poor people in their towns and villages as part of their Christian witness and mission. Now, Paul and Barnabas had been planting churches in a very different culture. They weren't in Jewish areas. They were with all sorts of other ethnic groups who didn't know about the Old Testament, didn't know about the law of Moses, and didn't know about God being a God of mercy and grace to the vulnerable. And there was no real tradition of charity to the poor in those communities. So it occurred to Peter to say to Paul, are you encouraging the non-Jewish ethnic believers to really focus on reaching out to people in need in their towns and villages, just like we are amongst the Jewish people? That's what Peter was saying to Paul. He was concerned that the Christian church and the gospel would not be really authentic unless there was a fundamental commitment to help the most vulnerable in their societies. Paul was able to quickly affirm to Peter, you've got nothing to worry about. We're doing exactly what you're doing in the Jewish communities. We're doing it in the Gentile communities. You see, Peter considered this remembering the poor as foundational to New Testament church life. And there was a particular challenge that they faced in the towns and cities that Paul visited. We know from social history that about 50% of people in any of those towns or cities would have been either living very much at subsistence level or in genuine dire poverty. 50% of the population. No established charity structure, hardly any social welfare, a very dark and difficult situation. And Paul encouraged his churches to reach out and help the poor as part of their foundational witness. And it appears that many of the poorest people in those communities actually became believers. Many were slaves who had severe economic hardships in many cases. Many widows seemed to be following the faith. Many women seemed to be attracted to the faith who had perhaps difficult domestic circumstances. People who felt vulnerable understood that the churches cared about them, cared for their practical needs, did something about them, and also preached the Christian message to them. And this is one of the reasons why the church grew so fast in the ancient world in the time of the New Testament. So here we have it in the New Testament, a priority that all churches based on biblical truth should remember the poor, with a particular emphasis of the poor in their immediate communities. So if we then fast forward to the 21st century in the UK, considering your church and my church, we have to say from a biblical point of view, we have an obligation to identify the needy people, those who are poor by the context that we live in, those who are vulnerable, as people that we care specifically about and focus our attention upon in our wider mission. We need to remember the poor, just as Paul needed to remember the poor, as the apostles practiced remembering the poor all the way through the New Testament church. So let's be New Testament churches in a biblical sense by remembering the poor. Thanks for listening.